Hi, thanks for joining tonight. I thought I would just start out our first meetup group and talk about what trauma is, since our group is about how to process it and deal with it and kind of come out in a positive
Hi,
light
thanks
on the
for
other
joining
side.
tonight. I thought I would just start out our first meetup group and talk about what trauma is, since our group is about how to process it and deal with it and kind of come out in a positive
Hi,
light
thanks
on the
for
other
joining
side.
tonight. So I thought we would just get started. Sorry for the feedback there. So what is trauma? So trauma is basically a very personal, individual perception of an event. It's an event or a thing or an interaction that happens. It can happen between people or with animals or humans or a natural disaster. Any number of things can be conceived or perceived as a traumatic event. I say it's very personal because what may be traumatic to one person may not be traumatic to another person. So if I call Sally a name on the playground and Sally has a different type of personality or resilience, she's not going to care. But if I call June a name on the playground and she has a different type of upbringing and personality and psychological resilience, she may take that to heart and that may be a very traumatic event to her. And that's kind of where people kind of get caught in that trap of categorizing and giving certain traumatic events a higher superiority or more, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but they think that some events are way more traumatic than others. And it really doesn't matter what the event is or what the occurrence is. All you need to know is that it's a personal perception or a personal interpretation of what happened. So, um, what's traumatic to one person is not going to be traumatic to the next. And it's not even necessarily that the event that occurs or that happens is traumatic, it's our perception of it. And it's the aftermath of that event. It's our emotional attachment to the aftermath of that event that traumatizes us. It causes distress, can cause shame, guilt, blame, depression, anger, bitterness, resentment, any number of emotions that we can react to are pretty normal to a traumatic event. But it's the trauma itself comes from our attachment to those distressing thoughts, to those feelings and emotions that that come as a result of the trauma or traumatic event. And as with all things, it's intertwined in our relationships, and those relationships then perpetuate or trigger certain parts of that trauma over and over and over again so that we can start reliving it. One of the reasons that we keep doing this is just as humans, we are kind of like giving ourselves a second chance to process it, learn from it, deal with it, and categorize it however we can make ourselves feel safe in that situation. So we keep subjecting ourselves to situations, people, and things of that nature, or that may remind us or make us feel triggered about the traumatic event to sort of make sense of that in our own mind about what's happening and coming to terms with it. It's kind of like I said, giving yourself a second chance, so to speak. So for me, it was easier to learn about what actually happens in my body, what happens in my brain, in my mind, what's happening inside, so I can kind of come to terms with or grasp and understand what's happening in my outside or my physical reality and why these patterns keep happening, so to speak. So I did a lot of reading, a lot of research, a lot of soul searching, a lot of different things, and a lot of it I just had to come to on my own after reading and research of several different books and authors and journals and all sorts of things. So I encourage you to advocate for yourself and keep searching for answers until you get the answers that make sense to you or resonate with you. But from a neuroscience perspective, they see trauma as an attachment that involves the sympathetic nervous system and the activation of your sympathetic nervous system. So this can cause that overvigilance or hypervigilance, if you will, in the amygdala, which is and the limbic system. So the amygdala is the part of the brain that houses part of our hippocampus, and the limbic system is the system in our brain that governs our emotions. So the hippocampus is the part of the brain that tells us when an event is over, when it's done, it's finished, it's in the past, it's not currently happening, it's not about to happen, but it's the part that says, hey, that already happened and we're good, we're done, it's over. So when you have a traumatic event, it becomes that activation of that system again, and that you can see where We get that hypervigilance, always thinking that something's going to happen, something bad's going to happen, or something's going to go wrong, if you will, because that part of the brain has been affected in a way that it stays active and it stays open and turned on, so that we don't really know, is it safe, is it not safe? We're constantly scanning for information when it comes to that. So chemically, the stress from trauma correlates with high levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, glutamate, adrenaline. It decreases your level of GABA, which is a positive neurotransmitter, and serotonin. And as we know, serotonin is the chemical responsible for keeping us in a happy mood. So when we don't process things and get it out and talk to someone or do some type of therapy, and by therapy, I mean that very loosely, not so much professional therapy, but also whatever that is for you. If that's your hobby, or spending time with family, or spending time alone, or camping, or fly fishing, or playing video games, whatever that is, so that you are doing something as an outlet for that energy, I consider that therapy. Some people consider running therapy. Some people consider yoga therapy. Some people want to talk to a therapist. Whatever works for you, I encourage you to do that. So what happens is, when we don't start to process it and get it out of our system, we will start to internalize it. That starts to attach itself to the muscles. It can become an ego attachment that interferes with our spiritual connection to our true self and what's really happening and going on with ourselves. We start to get kind of lost in the shuffle a little bit. For me personally, I feel like it's more of an energetic attachment as well. It can become a block or an imbalance in our system. It is like a disturbed vibration of energy, if you will, in our energetic field and in our electromagnetic field that we generate naturally, which in turn can affect our nervous system, our physical body, our mental health, our physical health. It has this trickle-down effect. So what affects one affects the whole, and it kind of ripples out and starts to affect everything. So how we feel chemically dictates how we start to feel mentally, and then physically, and then how we act and interact and react or respond to what's going on in our environment and our surroundings around us. So not dealing with one aspect of it can completely affect all aspects of everything that's going on. If you think of matter as basically frozen energy, and I'll talk more about energy later, but for now, just remember that blocked matter is basically like frozen energy. So matter and energy aren't really different. They're just different forms of the same reality, kind of like water. Frozen is ice, liquid is water. So it's the same substance, it's just different forms of the same substance. So when you have trauma, a lot of times we get this frozen or this stuckness or stuck feeling that we have about the event, because our body will literally capture and store that information in our cells. Cellular vibration is very important in terms of physical health and mental health, because there's a very distinct difference between cells that are healthy and cells that are unhealthy or sick. In fact, your cells, when you're sick or fighting a cold or flu, those cells actually operate at 40 millivolts less than the healthy cells. So it's a measurable difference in your physical body. So when you have this frozen or stuck energy that's dictating how your cells vibrate, so to speak, you can see where this can kind of come into play into things in your physical and mental health, which then affect the rest of your life and your reality. So another important thing to remember too is that once you have this energetic field established, so once you have this event happen and your body captures or stores it in your cells, and then you start to react a certain way chemically in your brain, and then mentally and physically in your body, and then you interact with others based on those experiences and those perceptions and interpretations, you create an electromagnetic field because your cells are vibrating at a certain rate. And everyone has different electromagnetic fields. And the best way to explain this is like if you've ever walked into a place or had someone walk into a room and you feel like the hair on the back of your neck, stand up, or if you feel like a weird queasy feeling in your stomach, when right before something is about to occur, that is kind of like your sixth sense. That's your electromagnetic field interacting with the electromagnetic field of another and letting you know, hey, this is not a good vibrational match. We need to, get out of here or change where we're at or whatever you need to do in the situation. But that's a great way to kind of explain in a physical reality what the electromagnetic field is in your body and how it interplays with everything in your life. So once you have this energetic field, just remember it wants to replicate itself. Take this into consideration when you're talking about memories and thought forms. People say, be careful what you say, be careful what you think. Your thoughts become your words become your reality. And it sounds cliche, but there is an element of truth to that, because, if you're thinking negative thoughts all the time, for instance, like what happens with chronic depression is that the ligands on the cells actually start to repel positive thoughts. And that's how chronic depression can result, because you start repelling positive thoughts and you only accept the negative thoughts because that's what you're used to and you want more of the same, right? So it's very hard to break that for people. But when you start thinking a certain way or feeling a certain way and you start emanating that out or putting that vibe out, if you will, then that starts to create what's going on around you. And that starts to draw in situations for you to either re-trigger your trauma to process it, or to grow in a different way, or to kind of have some peace and resolve about the situation and what's going on. So there's an element of truth to, your thoughts become your reality, so to speak. And speaking of electromagnetic fields, so I think it was in the late 70s, early 80s, there were a couple of researchers in France that were studying electromagnetic fields, and they realized that the meridians on the body, or the energetic lines on the body, where we, like for instance, in acupuncture, where they place the needles on your body, or an acupressure, like the pressure points where you're like putting pressure, or like an emotional freedom technique or EFT, the tapping points that they do, those are energetic lines on the body called meridians, and they actually have a lowered level of electrical resistance on the skin surface as compared to the surrounding areas. So I invite you to do what works for you. I've tried several different therapies: acupuncture, acupressure, and emotional freedom technique, or all of them. I feel like different things have helped me at different points along the way. So I encourage you to continue to try new and different things as you're drawn to them, or you feel like, hey, that might be a good idea. I wasn't ready for that before, but maybe now I'll give it a try. Maybe that's just what you need. So, and I find that sometimes I'll be really into one thing, and then I'll just kind of like, it'll fizzle off and I'll be really into something else. Or maybe it's a combination of a couple of things that will help during that situation. So really got to go with your gut on that. But I think for me, one of the biggest things, the biggest realizations was that, number one, you don't just get over it. So that's first and foremost. A lot of people are like, oh, you just need to get over it and move on. It doesn't happen that way. And we'll talk more about that in this series. But for me, to personally transform traumatic events that happened into something that I feel that I'm mostly at peace with now, was shifting my understanding of my consciousness. So the more, for me personally, the more I understood how it worked in my body, what was happening physically in my body, what was going on chemically in my brain, why I was acting and responding to people and situations the way that I was, why I was experiencing the same situations, the same circumstances, the same types of people. Have you ever like left a job and got a new job and you're like, oh, it's going to be better. And it's really like different bodies, but the exact same scenario. So same thing. It seems like there's a pattern, like it's always repeating itself. And at some point, I think we all kind of reach our bottom when it comes to that. And it's like, okay, enough is enough. I'm done. I'm tired. Don't want to play this game anymore. What am I supposed to learn? What is the situation trying to teach me? What do I need to know so that I can move on from this? Not forget about it, but move on in a healthy light. So it wasn't until I really started to think about things differently that happened to me and see it from a healthier mindset instead of like a victim mentality. That's when I started to see a big shift in how I physically felt. So when you shift out of ego attachment and start to become more philosophical about the events that have happened, or spiritual about what has happened, you start to lose some of that emotional attachment that we put on the specific event. And for me, that's key. So talking about rape and sex trafficking and sexual assault for me now is no different than telling you what color of socks I put on today, or if I had a sandwich, or that I brushed my teeth this morning. There's no emotional attachment to the event. To me, it's an event that happened. Yes, I learned and grew from it. No, I do not condone it or recommend anyone else going through that. But for me, you have to take that emotional charge away from it, because it's our emotional investment that becomes overwhelming, so to speak. And that's our emotional investment to the situation and the aftermath is really basically what keeps us kind of locked in that, so to speak, in that lesson, if you will, or in that whole scenario that gets tiresome and old and causes the same things to keep repeating over and over and over again. So removing the emotional charge so that the event becomes neutral. So, for instance, if you have a positive attachment to an event, you're going to remember all the good things about it. And just like if you have a negative attachment to an event, you're going to remember all the negative things about the event. And it's going to trigger a negative response or a positive response in the body based upon your perception of the event that happened. In Buddhism, they believe that all suffering is created by the mind, so all suffering can be relieved by the mind. I like that thought. I don't know that I buy it 100%. Some days I struggle with that more than others. It's a little bit harder for me to bite off and chew than other days. But if you think about it like that, okay, so if I change my perception of what happened, not making it okay and not condoning that, not saying it was a good thing and that or anything of that nature, but just saying this happened and reminding the hippocampus it's over with, it's done now, can allow you to kind of remove yourself from that, so to speak, and not be so like attached to that event. If you think of everything in our reality as energy that's vibrating, and energy is just information that vibrates, and the different rates of vibration determine what pattern that takes, whether that's a chair or water or a piece of clothing or whatever that is. It just determines the form that it takes. So trauma is also energetic information as well. And if you think about it, the trauma that happened, you're attaching a charge to it, but what goes into the event? So you've all heard, you guys know about the story, like if you make a recipe, like if you make your mom's recipe exactly the same way that she gives it to you, it doesn't taste the same as when she makes it because mom's putting mom's love into it. She's imparting a part of herself into that recipe. And the same thing with any other situation. The person attaches or imparts a part of themselves into what they're doing. For example, if you go to 30 different yoga classes and they're taught by 30 different teachers and every teacher says exactly the same script, it doesn't matter because you're going to get 30 different versions of that because those are 30 different versions of energy and information that are being imparted and passed on. They're imparting part of themselves into the information that they pass on to you, even if it's the exact same information. And that's why I say sometimes I need to hear things like 10 times from 10 different people because it's that 10th time where I'm like, oh, I kind of get that now. That's just how it works. So in the case of trauma, most trauma is usually a violent event or some sort of violence or some element of violence is usually involved in the event. With violence, there's usually a lot of anger, a lot of rage coming from another person. So if you have that energy that's being infused into the event, part of that person, part of their energy and their subtle energetic field gets imparted into what they're doing as well. So that's why we have so many conflicting feelings about it. A lot of people feel upset because they froze or they didn't yell or run or whatever. It doesn't matter. Those are all normal responses to trauma that help you survive, which is what the goal is. It doesn't matter what you did or did not do. You survived. And that's what our physical bodies are meant to do, is survive traumatic events. So it doesn't matter what happened during the event, it's what happens after the event and how we deal with it, how we see it, how we process it, and how we let go, so to an extent. So our nervous system, our cells, our energy system, they capture all this information and they store it. And like I said, that's why we have these conflicting feelings sometimes, because you may feel like victimized, but then you're also enraged, because there's a bit of rage or anger that got imparted or infused into that event. And you take that with you. Our body is pretty remarkable in the fact that it can heal itself, but it also acts like a sponge. And like I said, our cells and our muscles and our tissues, all of that take in that information and they store it. That informational field that forms from the storing of that information is called the thought field. And that's what is our actual physical reality. It can be measured, and they have measured it several times scientifically, but it's composed of all these subtle energies that are in our environment. Like I said before, like you may walk down a dark alley or may not want to go to the parking lot to your dark parking lot to get in your car at that moment because you just feel like something's off. that's part of that subtle energetic field letting you know that it's not okay. Like, hey, for your survival, for your protection and safety, don't do this right now. That's part of your intuition as well. So let's talk about triggers for a minute, because like I said, sometimes when we don't resolve things, we feel like we see there's a pattern that's repeating itself via people, situations, relationships, circumstances, whatever it is. We see this pattern emerging in different forms, but it's still the same pattern when you get down to the nitty gritty of it. So when you have a trigger, like I said, you get that response again. So for instance, if you're out and someone says something, a phrase, or someone's tone of voice, or a song comes on, or there's a smell, those things that trigger you, that take you right back to that moment, that traumatic event. What happens is that your body is sort of reliving that event again. So all of that trauma happens again, so to speak, chemically, physically, emotionally, all of those things. The brain, your neurochemistry, your conscious, your subconscious, your behaviors, your cognition, all of that gets triggered when you get triggered by something that has happened in the past. And that's because that's something that has happened to us in a traumatic way, and we have stored it. And so when we relive that as a way to process it in a little bit safer environment, we may, for instance, like if you, for me, I'll give a personal example. For me, it was the smell of a cologne that was a trigger for me, a certain type of cologne. And so while I wasn't in a traumatic event, when I would smell that smell, it still brought me right back to that event. But it was a safer environment because there was nobody else there. I was, at the mall going through Dillard's, perfume section or whatever. So it was a way for me to be exposed to that and be like, okay, so that's okay. That triggers that, but I'm safe. So it's a way to kind of expose yourself and kind of process it and breathe through it a little bit, if you will. So all this gets triggered when you hear something, smell something, taste something, feel something. It can be any number of things can be a trigger. Some people believe in acupuncture. Some people believe in tapping. Basically, what those things do with the meridians is they help disrupt the overload on the energetic system. So that you get like these energetic blockages, if you will, or adhesions, if you will, and that helps disrupt that. So the memory is the same, but like I said, the emotion and the meaning have changed. We're still involved in the traumatic event, but how invested you now are emotionally and the meaning of it is changed. How you view it and how you emotionally feel about it is changed. And that's where you start to get more peace of mind about things and not as uptight and tense. You can learn from it. You feel like you're able to grow from it, and you're able to help other people in that situation as well. And coming back to something else that I said earlier, people say like, oh, you should get over it. Well, that's so annoying. People, you don't get over it. Okay. Part of moving past that in a positive light is reconnecting the brain with the area of the body where the trauma is stored. Not necessarily where the trauma occurred, but where you stored that trauma. One thing that happens quite often in a traumatic event, especially childhood traumatic events, is you get disassociation that happens. Very, very normal response to trauma. A lot of people that are the victim of an assault or an attack or rape, they say they froze or they had an out-of-body experience, or it's like they were watching it from outside of their body. You leave your body, you numb, you sort of shut down and shut yourself out. That's what disassociation is. That's a very normal thing. It's a protective mechanism from your brain to help you survive that event, because a lot of times that's just so much information that is just too much for you emotionally. So you just kind of shut down until it's over, so to speak. But one of the big key things with trauma is to reconnect the brain with the parts of the body that shut down or shut off, especially with sexual abuse. And I'll give you a personal example. For me, sexually for a long time, it was not a big thing. Sex was a procedure. It was sterile. It was numb. And it was unfeeling. It was unemotional. Didn't need to know the person. Didn't care about the person. It didn't matter. It was just a thing that occurred, basically. But the reason why is because my mind and my brain, because what had happened to me as a traumatic experience as a child, when it comes to that, my brain had learned to just shut down. And when that part of my body was exposed or stimulated or activated in any way, I would just shut down. So there was no like real connection between my brain and that part of my body. So there's total disconnect, disassociation there. At any rate, part of working through that is realizing that not all touch is bad, that not all people are bad, how to set healthy boundaries with people, how to be respectful with your boundaries, and be firm with your boundaries with people too. So I started noticing that my breathing, when I would be in that situation, that my breathing would be really stiff and really shallow, which is normal when you're in a traumatic situation. Part of working through that was taking deeper breaths or breathing into it, or being with someone who could respect your boundaries and understand what's going on, being open with someone that you are intimate with and say, hey, I just need a minute, help me breathe through this, or whatever it is. So just like being in a crowd of people, instead of having a panic attack, yes, that's a triggering event that may bring back a memory or a feeling that isn't pleasant. But now you can look at it from a different place. You can take a deep breath and say, okay, yeah, there's a lot of people, but not all of these people are out to harm me. Take a deep breath. I can view it differently. I know how to handle it. I know how to cope with it more positively now. We get into trouble because a lot of times our body and our emotion doesn't understand that we've already survived the trauma, that it's in the past. And it's kind of like they don't know. Like I said, the hippocampus, that part of the brain that says things are in the past, the hippocampus is still on, so to speak, and you don't get the message that it's done, it's over with. So they keep us, these chemicals keep being released, and we're in this perpetual trauma mode. So on a subconscious level, we're constantly in that fight or flight state of mind. Our relationships start to become a source of danger instead of a source of nourishment. And we start to view everyone as a threat. And this is where the hypervigilance and overvigilance can come in. And I'm speaking from personal experience here because it appears that the problem with people that are chronically neglected or chronically traumatized over and over again, as in molestation or incest or sex trafficking, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, whatever type of abuse it is or trauma it is, it happens on a regular basis. And especially in children, it's usually from a caregiver. It's usually from someone they know, and it's usually someone that's a caregiver. As a child, as an infant, we rely on that person for our well-being and our survival. So just like in the wild, the babies stay close to mom and dad because they're more able to fight or escape, and their chance of survival is much higher. So as a child, as an infant, we are supposed to be able to have secure attachments with people that are caregivers and trust them. Most of the time, that's our only defense as an infant or a small child, is to form some type of secure attachment with someone older or bigger that can take care of us or ensure our safety and survival to some extent. And sometimes that's our only defense, like I was saying. But with cases of childhood abuse, you don't really get that attachment and the healthy, secure attachment to a caregiver, a parent, or loved one. And so then everyone becomes a risk. And every person, every situation, you're constantly scanning, thinking about the worst that's going to happen, thinking, oh, this can go wrong, that can go wrong, they can say this, they can do that. Or for me personally, another thing that I would think was like when something good would happen, like, oh, that's great, but when's the bad thing going to happen? When's this going to happen? And that's just tiresome. It's exhausting, really, to think that way all the time. But that's just where my state of mind was at that point in my healing. So these thoughts influence our immune system as well. So our immune system operates according to our emotional messaging system, which is peptides, which travel through our limbic system. And remember, our limbic system is the system in the brain that governs our emotions. If that's always turned on and we always have these chemicals, these peptides always streaming, our body's always in that fight or flight hypervigilant mode. And then if we get to a point where we can't find something to attack, then our body will turn that inward and we'll start to attack ourselves. So cue autoimmune diseases here. I'm not saying that's the cause of every autoimmune disease, but I'm just saying it's one of the things that can correlate with autoimmune disease. That's why it's so important when you have a traumatic event to process it and let it go, because it will not only affect your physical health, but your mental health as well. And cue the ACE studies. I encourage you, if you haven't heard yet about the Adverse Childhood Event Study, That was started by Kaiser Permanente and then taken over by the CDC. It's now one of the largest studies of its kind. I encourage you to go to the CDC website and check it out. I'll put up a video later. I think I may have already put one up on the ACE studies. But the ACE studies basically prove scientifically that show when you're exposed to trauma as a child and the types of trauma or the number of events, it can relate to chronic disease in your 20s and 30s later in life, or I don't want to say later in life, after your teen years, so to speak. So these are the people that are, getting cancers and heart disease in their 20s and 30s. This is the person that drops dead of a heart attack at 35 without any warning. So think about these things when you're not ready to process trauma yet, because it will absolutely catch up with you at some point or another. Personal experience, had my own health issues for a while when I chose not to deal with trauma versus having dealt with it and now not having health issues. It's night and day. So we will reconvene. I appreciate all you guys joining tonight. Thank you for your support. And look for me on meetup.com. I'm located here in Colorado Springs, Colorado, but I plan on doing more meetups online via this way so that we can all kind of connect and chat. There will be physical meetups too. And so I encourage you to look for information that helps you. I hope that this was something that can help you in your journey of healing along the way. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or write to me. I would love to answer them and share whatever I can to help you. Whatever's helped me, hopefully will help you. And our next meeting will be the first part of February. We're going to talk a little bit about how trauma affects us physically and emotionally in our lives and what that can look like. Again, it's on meetup.com, and the name of our group is Transcending Trauma. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email or write to me at angiemarler.com. Thanks, you guys. Have a good night.